Relax and listen to the voice. The following stories are scary stories based on and around camping. Here we go. Many years ago, there was an exclusive boarding school in England that had a scout troop. The leader of the scout troop was a teacher, and one weekend per month he would take the scouts on a camping trip. There was one young boy in the scout troop who was very disobedient and disruptive. His name was Stanley Jenkins, and he was always getting into mischief. No matter how many times the teacher told him off, he just would never listen. One weekend, the scouts went camping in the English countryside. They got permission to set up camp on a farmer's land. The spot was on a ridge overlooking a deep valley. The teacher, of course, warned the boys not to go off wandering on their own and told them that under no circumstances were they allowed to go down into the valley. While the teacher and the other scouts were pitching the tents, Stanley Jenkins and his friends were sitting around in the grass. They were too lazy to help set up camp, and instead they went looking for some kind of mischief they could get up to. As Stanley Jenkins gazed down into the valley, he noticed a field that was surrounded by barbed wire fence. At one corner of the field, there was an old stone well. It looked like the field was never used, and it was overgrown with weeds and brambles. Just then, they saw the farmer who owned the land coming with his dog. As he passed by, Stanley Jenkins waved at him, and the farmer stopped to talk. "What's in that field down there?" said Stanley Jenkins. "The one with the well inside it." "Well, that's the wishing well," the farmer replied. "But you're not allowed to go down there. I hope your teacher told you that." "Wishing well?" said Stanley Jenkins. "You mean if you throw some money into the well, you can make a wish?" The farmer let out a grim laugh. "I wouldn't know," he said. "That's what they call it. But nobody around here goes near the wishing well. In all the years that I've lived here, I've never set a foot in that field." "What's the matter with it?" asked Stanley Jenkins. "All I know is the cows and the sheep keep away from it. Even my old dog wouldn't go through that field, and neither should you boys if you've got a brain in your heads. They say that it's haunted." "Haunted?" Stanley scoffed. "Haunted by who?" "3 women and a man," said the farmer gravely. "Who are they?" asked Stanley. "It all happened before my time," said the farmer. "But I was told they died in the well, or were found dead in it. I saw them once. It was twilight, and I was standing on this very ridge. My old dog saw them too. They came out of the bushes and went crawling around, 4 of them, just black rags and white bones. It seemed as if I could hear their bones clacking as they moved. I couldn't make out their faces. All I could see was their teeth." At this, the boys let out a collective gasp. Stanley chuckled. "What happened then?" he asked. "I don't know," said the farmer. "My old dog took off running, and I took off running after him. So take my advice, boys. Steer clear of that wishing well, if you know what's good for you." With that, the farmer tipped his hat and walked off. The boys just stared after him. "Oh, what a load of bull," said Stanley. "I don't believe a word of it." The next evening, the teacher gathered the scouts and did a head count. He noticed one of the boys was missing. After doing a roll call, he discovered that the missing boy was none other than Stanley Jenkins. None of the other scouts seemed to have any idea where he was. Then one boy spoke up. "Maybe he went down to the wishing well, sir," he said. The teacher's face went pale. The wishing well? He gasped. But you were all given strict instructions not to go down there. The scouts followed the teacher as he walked up onto the top of the ridge and looked down into the valley below. The light was fading and it was getting cold, but there wasn't a breath of wind in the air. Boys, can anyone see him? The teacher asked. There he is, said one of the boys, getting over the barbed wire fence. Do you see him? Yeah, that's him, said another boy. I recognize his sweater. Now he's making his way towards the wishing well. Ugh, that little idiot, the teacher growled. At that moment, one of the boys let out a high-pitched scream and covered his eyes. What's that black thing on the path, crawling on all fours? It's a woman. Oh, God, don't let me look at her, cried another boy. Stop it, the teacher said loudly. Get a hold of yourselves. I'm going down there. Hancock and Fartleby, you run to the farmer's house and call for help. The rest of you boys, stay here and don't move. The teacher ran off, leaving the boys alone on the ridge, staring down at the field below. To their horror, they saw another black figure emerge from the bushes, and then another, and another. They saw Stanley making his way towards the wishing well. He didn't seem to notice the black figures approaching him, shuffling forward with their arms outstretched. The boys started yelling as loud as they could, trying to warn him. As he reached the wishing well, Stanley Jenkins seemed to hear their cries. He suddenly stopped and turned around, and then he let out a scream more piercing and dreadful than any of the boys on the ridge, but it was too late. The black figures closed in on him until he was surrounded on all sides, and then they pounced. The boys stared at the scene below in a terrified silence. They could hardly breathe as they watched the horrific struggle. The hood of one of the black figures fell back, revealing a white skull with stringy wisps of hair. Their gnarled, bony fingers were ripping and tearing at Stanley Jenkins, and soon his awful screaming ceased. The boys spotted their teacher running towards the field. He scrambled through the barbed wire fence, but then he stopped and wouldn't go any further. The farmer arrived with a number of policemen. The boys pointed down at the field below and screamed, "They got him! They got him!" over and over again. The policemen ran down into the valley. The headmaster arrived and all the boys were transported back to the school. Some of them were so traumatized that they later left the school. The teacher stayed there with the police all night. And the next morning at dawn, they found what was left of Stanley Jenkins at the bottom of the wishing well. He had been torn to pieces. Sadly, his parents had to come and collect his remains. The farmer put up another barbed wire fence encircling the field and then erected large signs with "Danger" and "Keep Out" written in large red letters. Locals in the area say that the field is now haunted by 5 ghostly black figures, 3 women, a man, and a young boy. Mark and Jackie had been dating for months. They met in college and both of them loved the outdoors. One weekend, they decided to go on a camping trip together in the woods. On the first night, they were sitting around their campfire, listening to the radio, when a news report came on. It said that a hiker named Stuart Becker had gone missing in the woods. There had been no sign of him for 3 days. There had been other hikers who went missing under mysterious circumstances in the same part of the woods, and police feared that there might be a serial killer on the loose. The next day, They were out collecting firewood when they spotted a suspicious man in a flannel lumberjack-type shirt. He was crouching down by the river and washing his knife in the water. "Oh my God, Mark!" Jackie hissed. "He's cleaning blood off that knife!" "Don't get worried," Mark replied. "He's probably just a hunter." Just then, the man looked around and noticed them. He had an angry look on his face, and he began running towards them, clutching his knife. "Jackie, run!" Mark shouted. They raced through the forest, jumping over ditches and pushing their way through the undergrowth. They kept running as fast as they could, but the man was always close behind them. Eventually, they came to a clearing in the trees and stopped to catch their breath. Jackie took out her cell phone and tried to call the police, but she couldn't get a signal. On top of this, they were lost and they had no idea where to go. All of a sudden, they noticed a figure standing on the ridge above them. It was a man in a yellow jacket, and he was beckoning them to follow him. The killer was getting closer and closer, and Mark and Jackie were desperate to escape. They scrambled up the ridge and ran in the direction that the man in the yellow jacket was pointing. They burst through the trees and found themselves on a main road. Mark ran out into the middle of the road and flagged down a car. When the killer saw them getting into the car, he gave up the chase, turned around, and went back into the woods. With the help of the driver, Mark and Jackie made it to the nearest town and called the police to tell them what they had seen. When the police arrived, they returned to the woods, but there was no sign of the killer. Just then, Mark noticed a figure lying on the ground. It was the man in the yellow jacket, and he had several stab wounds in his back. The policeman turned him over. "It's Stuart Becker, the missing hiker," he said. "It looks like he's been dead for about 3 days. I was 12 years old and my parents sent me to Camp Birchwood, a fantastic all-boys camp in northern Minnesota. There was a very special camping trip that only happened once a summer. Only a select group of boys were asked to go on it, and my name was called. My 2 best friends, Jimmy and Jesse, were also going on the trip, and we could not contain our excitement. While we were getting ready, some of the other boys started whispering, "You know that the campsite you're going to on Leech Lake? Well, it's haunted." I thought that they were just trying to freak us out and get us nervous before the trip, but I wasn't going to let them ruin it for me. The day of the trip came, and when we got to the campsite, it was a thick, dense, wooded area. We set up our tents and sat down to roast marshmallows around the campfire. Of course, someone said, "You know, this place is haunted." One of the counselors said, "I come here every year with a group of boys, and I always go back with one less." We all just laughed it off, and then afterwards, we went back to our tents. We lay awake, talking for a while, and then gradually, we each fell asleep. A couple of hours later, I woke up and I needed to go to the bathroom, but I didn't want to go on my own. And just then, I saw a light passing by the tent. I unzipped the tent and stuck my head out, but there was nobody there. The campsite was empty and eerily silent. It seemed odd to me, but instead of going out to use the restroom, I just laid back down and tried to go to sleep. A little while later, I heard a roar way off in the distance. It sounded like engines revving. Vroom, 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 vroom. I thought I was hearing things, but it seemed like it was coming closer. And then suddenly, I heard a high-pitched scream. It chilled me to the bone. I was completely freaked out, so I shook my friends awake and told them to listen. They heard it too. "There's something out there," I said. Those screams were so blood-curdling, they had to have come from someone who was badly hurt. The roaring sound got closer and closer until it sounded like it was circling our tent. There were lights going around and around as well. It sounded like motorcycles circling faster and faster. Then we heard the screams again. We didn't know if they were going to kill us or drive the motorcycles through our tent. We were so scared, we were just holding on to one another the whole time. And then the sounds suddenly stopped. Taking a deep breath, Jimmy and I stuck our heads out through the tent flap. There was nobody there. No lights, no people, nothing except for complete silence. That really freaked us out, so we got back inside and zipped up the tent. We huddled together, and I don't know if it was the sheer terror or exhaustion, but somehow we finally fell asleep. The next morning, when we got out of our tent, we looked down and saw that there were tire tracks circling our entire tent. The tracks weren't anywhere else, just around our tent. My God, I thought. This really happened, and nobody else heard anything. When we got back to Camp Birchwood, I was talking to some counselors who had gone on the trip when they were young. "Oh, you went to the haunted campsite," they said. "Yeah. Do you know anything about that?" I asked. "You never heard about what happened out there? Back in the 1970s, there were some college students, 2 girls and a guy, I think, who decided to take a weekend break. They jumped on their motorcycles and they headed up to Leech Lake to go camping. They were murdered up there by a guy with a chainsaw, and he cut their bodies up into pieces. For nearly 1 solid minute, I don't think I could breathe. Oh my God, I thought to myself. The motorcycles, the screaming, the tire tracks around our tent. Could this have been the ghosts of those college kids? Maybe this was their way of warning us and telling us to stay away, because whoever hurt them was still out there, lurking in the woods. My name is Tommy, and I think that I might be going insane. I grew up in a normal middle-class home with loving parents and a sweet little sister. Everything seemed fine until one day when I came back from camp and something very strange happened. I came back from summer camp where I was staying for about 2 months out of the summer. The camp was great. We did a lot of fun things. We learned to start fires, we dissected owl pellets, and they taught us how to fish using different kinds of lures. Well, anyway, I came home from camp, and when I walked into the living room, I saw something that disturbed me. My mother and father were sitting on the couch, smiling and staring at the TV. The weird thing was that the TV wasn't on, yet they were staring at it intently. They both turned their heads simultaneously at the exact same speed and looked at me and said, "Hello, Timmy." That seemed really strange to me, and for some reason it gave me a lump in my throat. One of the reasons I know for sure is that my name is Tommy. How could my own parents make a mistake like that? "Is everything okay?" I asked nervously. "Everything is perfect, Timmy," my father replied. They were both just sitting there, smiling from ear to ear. It was creepy. I decided to go upstairs and talk to my little sister. When I walked into her room, she was lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling. "Have you noticed anything strange about Mom and Dad?" I asked. She sat bolt upright, extremely fast, smiled at me and said, "No, Timmy, Mom and Dad are just perfect." Seeing her sit up like that and seeing the smile on her face made my blood suddenly run cold. And she said, "Timmy, my name is Tommy." Without another word, I backed out of the room. She was still smiling at me as I closed the door. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't shake the sneaking suspicion that there was something wrong with my entire family. I went into my bedroom and I tried to think of what I could do. I heard my mother coming up the stairs. She went into her bedroom and closed the door. I decided to spy on her, so I went into the hallway and I peeked through her keyhole. What I saw through that terrified me. My mother was changing clothes, and she was standing with her back to me, and I immediately noticed something very shocking. Her skin was very pale, and it looked like there was a zipper that ran all the way down her back. Whatever she wasn't my mom. And that's when the panic set in. I ran down the stairs and out the front door. As I was dashing down the driveway, I looked back and I saw my father at the front door. He dropped down on all fours, started growling like an animal, began howling and started chasing after me like he was some kind of mad dog or like a raging demon. Since then, I'd been on the run. All I can do is keep moving. Now that I know their secret, they can't afford to let me live. I keep moving from place to place, begging on the street for spare change. I tried to go to the police, but they wouldn't believe me. They just said I was a runaway, and they tried to either lock me up or bring me back to my parents. A couple of times I just narrowly managed to escape. I tried to even go to the media, but every reporter I spoke to just laughed in my face. I'm really tired of running. I'm pretty sure they killed my real family. I feel like my only reason for living now is to get revenge. Can anybody help me? If you can, just ask around. Somebody should know me by now. Just ask around for me. My name is Timmy. My little sister Zoe is 13 now. I just turned 20. I really love her, and I think that I owe her my life. I was about 7 years old when she was born, and I was so excited to finally have a little sister. At first, as a child, I was kind of jealous that she was getting all the attention from my parents, so I didn't pay much attention to her. Sometimes I was just downright mean to her. However, all of that changed on the day that I realized my sister had a special talent. We were sitting on the couch watching TV. I was babysitting Zoe while my parents were out camping for a weekend getaway. All of a sudden, Zoe sat up, looked at me and said, "Daddy isn't coming home." I was really confused. I said, What did you say, Zoe?" "Daddy isn't coming home," she repeated. This was a really weird thing for her to say, and it unnerved me. I tried to question her further, but she wouldn't say anything more about it. About half an hour later, the phone rang, and when I answered, there was a police officer on the other end, and he sounded gravely serious. He explained that there had been a traffic accident, and that my parents' car had driven off one of the steep one-lane country roads. My mother was in the hospital with relatively minor injuries, but my father had not been so lucky. He died on the way to the hospital. The next few hours were an absolute blur. I switched off the TV and sat there in shock, thinking of what I should do. Should I pack Zoe up in the car and drive to the hospital? Do I go over to the neighbor's house? Do I call a family member or one of my friend's parents? I was completely numb, and I was just a teenager. I didn't know what to do. They say that Zoe was too young to grasp the situation, but she understood that Dad was gone, and he wasn't coming back. Somehow, I think she understood it and knew about it before me. Almost a year later, there was another incident. It was a nice warm summer day, and Zoe and I were in the park. Zoe was playing on the grass, and all of a sudden she stopped and she pointed at something. "There's a bad man over there," she said. "We need to go." And when I looked in the direction that she was pointing, I saw a man standing there. He was dressed in a gray hooded sweatshirt. He had his hands in his pockets, and he seemed to be waiting for someone, but something about him just seemed strange. With the memory of the occurrence surrounding our father's death still fresh in my mind, I didn't question Zoe. I just grabbed her by the hand, and together we hurried off away from the man across the park. The next morning at breakfast, my mother, who was still recovering from a traumatic head injury, was reading the newspaper, and I noticed a headline on the front page. The headline read, "Mother and daughter stabbed to death in park." Beneath it, there was a picture of police officers leading a man away in handcuffs. It looked like the man in the gray hooded sweatshirt. A chill ran down my spine, and any doubts that I had before were immediately squashed. My little sister definitely had a talent. From that day forward, I listened carefully to anything she had to say, and I would write it down in a notebook that I kept in my room. One day, when Zoe was about 8 years old, it happened again. We were at a restaurant when Zoe suddenly dropped her knife and fork, looked at my mother and I, and said, "Grandpa's gone." Just over an hour later, maybe, my mother got a phone call telling her that our grandfather had passed away in his sleep. Mom was very sad, but she'd been prepared for the bad news. That was the last prediction for a long time. As the years passed by, I gradually forgot about my sister's talent. It got to the point to where I began to dismiss it all as just nothing more than a coincidence. However, last week, when my girlfriend and I were spending some time together in our apartment, I got a text message. It was from Zoe. Zoe's text said, "I need to tell you something." And I replied in turn, "Sure, Zoe, what is it?" Zoe then replied, "I need you to listen to me. I have a terrible feeling. Something is going to happen. You and Megan need to get out of there. Go to a hotel or something. Just get out of there." I was startled by this and also confused, and I replied with, "Why? What's going on?" Zoe then sent another flurry of texts. "I don't know. I told you what I know, and that's all I know. Now do what I say and get out of there." I responded with, "Okay, Zoe, I understand." I immediately grabbed my girlfriend, forced her to pack some things in a suitcase, and rushed her out of the apartment. We went to a nearby hotel and booked a room for the night. The very next morning, I got a phone call from our neighbor. He said that our apartment had been broken into, but strangely, nothing had been taken. When he heard strange noises, he called the police, and they arrived in time to arrest the intruder. Police requested that we come down to the station. Apparently, Megan's mentally unstable ex-boyfriend had broken into our apartment. He was armed with duct tape, a knife, gasoline, and a box of matches. He was planning to kill both of us. He also had a note in his pocket, which suggested that he was going to burn the house down with himself inside of it after getting rid of Megan and myself. When my girlfriend heard that, she was utterly dumbfounded. All she could say was, "How did your sister know?" Without Zoe, we would both probably be dead. It still haunts me. Nobody else believes it, and even my girlfriend is still a little skeptical. But I know what happened. My little sister Zoe, she has a talent. A man named Charles was going on a camping trip with his brother's wife, and their 3 children. Since there wasn't enough room for 6 people in one car, Charles decided to take his own car and caravan. They drove for a few hours, but during the long ride, Charles got a flat tire. They had to pull over in the middle of nowhere to fix the flat. Charles's brother wanted to stay with him while he changed the tire, but Charles insisted that he go on ahead because the children were tired and becoming restless from the long ride. He asked his brother if he would mind setting up his tent when they got to camp, and then said that he would quickly catch up, and he told them not to worry. So Charles's relatives drove on, while Charles stayed behind and changed the tire. When he was finished, he called his brother on the cell phone, but for some strange reason, no one answered. He left a voice message saying that he was on his way, but they never called back. Charles assumed that they had made it to the destination, and they were probably unpacking everything. He drove a few more hours and a few more miles, waiting for an answer from his brother, but he never received one. At this point, it was getting late into the night, and Charles was getting very tired. There were no hotels to stay in at that area, and he didn't assume that he would be out this long, but having to change his tire set him back some time. Normally, he would have made it to the campsite by now. Charles didn't want to sleep in his car, and as he thought, luckily for him, he spied a house out in the middle of nowhere. He called his brother one last time and left another message. "Hey Mark, this is Charles. Listen man, I'm tired of driving. Changing that tire really took the wind out of me, and it took way too much time. Honestly, if I keep headed towards the campsite, I'm worried that I might fall asleep behind the wheel. I'm gonna go and see if I can spend the night in this little house just up the road. Don't worry about anything. I'm a big boy. I can take care of myself. I'll be okay. I'll see you tomorrow morning, bright and early." When Charles pulled up to the house, an old man cracked open the front door and greeted him. Charles, in turn, greeted the man in a friendly manner. He explained his situation to the old man and asked if it would be possible to stay inside of his home for the night. After a moment of thought, the old man agreed and kindly let him stay for the night. Inside, the home was dark, dingy, and decrepit. The old man offered to cook Charles dinner, and Charles kindly accepted. Charles sat down at the dining table chatting with the old man and waited for the old man to serve the food. The man came out of the kitchen carrying a piping hot platter. At first, Charles thought it was meatloaf, but as he bit into the meaty dish a few more times, he realized that it wasn't meatloaf. "Sir, this is delicious. What is it called?" "It's a Spanish dish," replied the old man. "It's called El Carne de tus Familias." Charles was confused by that. "Oh, Spanish, huh? What does that mean in English?" he asked. The man looked down, shuffled his feet, looked back up at Charles, and slyly smiled. And then he said, "It means the meat of your relatives." This is a strange memory, but even now I can still recall it vividly. It happened during a summer vacation, right after I'd returned home from a few weeks away at summer camp, when I was, I guess, in 5th grade. At the time, my family lived in a house on the edge of town. Behind the house, there was a large area of wasteland. I often went out there to play. As I had just gotten back from summer camp, I still had this camping, rugged mentality kind of bug going on, and my parents let me go exploring in a field with the intention to camp there for the night. They knew exactly where I was going to be, and it wasn't that far away from the house, so they saw it as no problem. It was early in the day, and I was exploring the far corner of this wasteland when I came across a patch of ground that had been paved over with concrete. In the middle of the concrete, there was a rusty iron door that seemed like it probably led down to a sewer. When I grabbed the handle of the door and opened it, I could see a ladder leading down into the darkness. As soon as I saw it, I wanted to go down there and explore. It seemed like it would be some big adventure. I immediately ran back home and got a flashlight. Brimming with excitement, but knowing that my parents wouldn't want me to go down into this sewer hole, I lied to them and told them that I'd found my camping spot and wanted to have my flashlight for the night. I turned back out of the house, ran back to the patch of concrete, turned on the flashlight, and climbed down the ladder. When I got to the bottom, I found myself in a large, dark passageway that ran from left to right. The floor was covered in wire mesh, and further down the passageway, there seemed to be recesses in the walls. I could hear the sound of flowing water, but I was sure that it wasn't a sewer because there wasn't any bad sewage smell. I decided to walk down the passageway, illuminating the way with my flashlight. It was exciting, and I wondered where the passageway would lead me. After walking for a little while, I found that the way was blocked by large metal bars. It was a dead end. However, when I shone the flashlight around, I noticed a ladder on the wall that led up to another iron door. Slightly disappointed at this being the end of my road, I climbed up the ladder and I opened this second iron door. I had only walked a short distance, so I expected that when I came out, I would be on the opposite side of the road or somewhere else in the field. However, when I climbed out, I found myself in a place that I didn't immediately recognize. It was familiar, but at the same time, there was something really different about it. Even more surprising was the fact that the sun was setting already. I knew that I'd only been down in that passageway for a few minutes, and it was only supposed to be around 2 p.m., but it was already getting dark. Something wasn't right. I kind of started to get scared, and I decided to go home. As I looked around, I noticed more strange but subtle differences. The whole neighborhood seemed to have undergone some slight changes. The convenience store on the corner where I always bought sweets from simply wasn't there anymore. In the spot where it should have been, there was a house. I also noticed a road sign on the street that I'd never seen before. This was unlike any sign that I'd ever come across, and I couldn't understand the symbols that were drawn on it. When I rushed back to my house, I was horrified to discover that it was also slightly different as well. Instead of blooming flowers in the garden, there was now a huge cactus. A red car with a strange design was parked in the driveway. Beside the front door, instead of a doorbell, there was now a small lever pointing downwards. 2 large, garish ornaments like a giraffe with 6 legs stood on either side of the entrance. This was certainly my house. I mean, the numbers were on the gate. My family's last name was on the letterbox. But at the same time, it wasn't my house. There's too many details that were different. Something was very, very wrong. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. I was too scared to go inside, just in case somehow I got lost and wound up in a different neighborhood or something. I went around the back and I peeked in through the kitchen window. As I stared into the living room, I could see my father. He was sitting on the couch, but he was dressed in some kind of long, flowing purple robe. I'd never seen him wear anything like that, and it was really uncanny. I began to get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I felt like I was going to be sick. Something just screamed out to me that this wasn't my home. Something said that I was somewhere else, somewhere that I didn't belong. Right around this time, I'd been playing this old computer game, and in the game, the hero accidentally falls into some kind of alternate reality. It was a world like our very own, but there were very big differences. In the game, it was called the Hidden World. That's where I am, I thought. I've accidentally slipped into the hidden world. I was terrified at that thought, but it made me realize that I had to get back to my world. I rushed back across the street to the iron door in the ground, and I climbed down the ladder, and then I ran through the underground passage at full speed, hurrying back the way I'd come. My heart was beating so fast, and a cold sweat was dripping off of my forehead. I was so scared, and I was almost out of breath. All that I could think of was getting back to my own world. When I climbed up the ladder and emerged from the iron door, it was bright daylight. I ran back to my house and found it just the way that I'd left it. My father's car was in the driveway, the flowers were back in the garden, and the doorbell was beside the front door. Inside, my mother and father were wearing their normal clothes. Everything seemed to be back to normal. After that, I was honestly afraid to go anywhere near the wasteland behind my house. I couldn't even bear to look at it. I had absolutely no desire to explore the underground passage any further. I was afraid that if I ever went down there again, I'd get stuck in that world and never be able to return to my own. My parents sold the house and we moved to another house. Little by little, I forgot about that underground passage. Just 6 months ago, I went with my parents to visit one of our old neighbors in that neighborhood, and I decided to take a walk and pay a visit to our old house. I wondered if the underground passage was still there. When I got to the house, I saw that the wasteland behind it had been used for construction. There were a lot of new houses, and the iron door and the concrete had vanished. The other iron door on the other side of the street had disappeared too. It looked as if they had both been paved over with concrete. And that little corner store, well, that was gone. Where the corner store once sat, there was now a large house. A young married couple decided that they needed a break. They decided that they wanted to take a vacation out in the country. Browsing through the holiday ideas online, they settled on a relaxing camping trip and outdoor excursions in the English countryside. The wife booked their plane tickets, and they decided to stay in a small little village on the west coast. When their plane touched down in England, it was midday, and after a long bus ride, they reached their destination. It was a very peaceful rural area, and there were a few houses and farms dotted about the roadway on the journey to this wilderness area where they were to stay. Once they arrived and walked up to the lodge that served as the camp host's site, they went inside. Once they were in, the woman who greeted them told them that there were no more campsites available. The couple told her that they had already booked their site online, but the woman could find no record of their reservation. "Well, you're just going to have to figure something out for us," said the husband angrily. "We've already paid for the site." "Well, we have one unoccupied site," the receptionist said, "but that's Site 13. I really shouldn't let you stay there." "Oh, yes, you will," said the husband as he snatched the site marker from her hand. Without another word, he picked up their bags and their tent, and the couple made their way off towards the site. The camp host just stood there with her mouth agape. The man and his wife found Site 13 very quickly. However, once they walked upon the actual campsite, they were greeted by a very foul smell. "Ugh, it stinks out here," said the wife, holding her nose in disgust. Ugh, this vacation is turning into a disaster. I knew we should have never chosen such a remote location. These country people live like pigs. We should have just stayed at a hotel. They scoured the site to see if there was something there that was making it smell so horribly and could find nothing. They tried to put the smell out of their senses and out of their mind, took a walk, and took some pictures of the beautiful scenery. When the couple returned to their campsite, they noticed that all of their bags were unpacked, and the site had been raked and cleaned up and looked much more presentable. Everything looked lovely and clean. The man and woman got closer to the center of the site, and they heard something like the cry of a woman. "What is that?" said the wife. They both turned around, and there stood the camp host, who had obviously heard the noise, and stood there with her jaw wide open. "Why are you so scared?" asked the wife. The host tried to speak, moving her mouth soundlessly, took a large gulp, and said, "A few years ago, a husband and wife were staying at this site, and one night, the woman called Emily went out to see her old friend, Richard, who also had a campsite in this park. The woman's partner, Tony, he went out to find her because he thought that she was cheating on him with Richard. He drug her back to this site, and she was crying. It was very quiet that night, and apparently Tony pushed her into the tent, where she was beaten and killed. Other people have stayed here since, and it's always ended up in murder. I suggest that you two get out of this place, go back to town, and find a hotel. Whatever you do, just don't stay here." "Oh my God, that's nonsense," shouted the husband. "I have never heard of anything like that, or never heard of a ghost harming a living person. That idea is preposterous. Get out of here. We need to go to bed." That night, as the camp host was closing up the lodge, she turned to close and lock the door, and all of a sudden, she heard a scream. The camp host froze with fear and then started running to the campsite. When she got there, she pulled out her flashlight, burst into the site, and shone the light at the tent. There, she saw the man standing over the dead woman's body with a bloody kitchen knife in his hand. This story is about a young boy named Mac Tolliver. Mac lived with his mother and his father in an old mansion on the edge of a forest. The family was very wealthy, and they owned a lot of the surrounding land. However, as time went by, the family fell on hard times, and the parents were forced to sell their land to some property developers. The young boy loved playing in the forest, and he didn't want his parents to sell it. When the deal finally went through, the young boy, knowing nothing of the real world, was furious with his parents, and he went out of his mind. One dark night, he crept into his parents' bedroom and murdered them with a knife. The parents' bodies were found by the police a few days later. They were hanging from the ceiling, and their throats were slit from ear to ear. Written on the wall in their blood was a message that said, "You shouldn't have sold the land," and it was signed Mac Tolliver. The boy was never seen or heard from again. A few years later, the developers turned the land into a summer camp. The mansion where the Tolliver family had lived and died was still standing, but over the years it had become dilapidated and was now abandoned. The first summer that the camp opened, 2 of the campers went missing. The camp counselors organized 2 search parties to go out into the woods and search for them. Eventually, the missing campers were found, but it was a horrifying scene. They were hanging by their necks from the branches of a tree, and their throats had been sliced open. There was a wooden board nailed to the tree above them with a message on it, written in blood. The message read, "Stay off my land. No trespassing." And it was signed, Mac Tolliver. The next summer, the camp was still open. Around the campfire, the camp counselors told the campers the story of Mac Tolliver and how he had murdered his family. All of the kids were terrified. There was one kid that summer who everyone liked to pick on. He was a quiet, shy kid named Cam, and the others always made him the butt of their jokes. The camp counselors decided to play a prank on the kids. After telling them the story of what had happened all those years ago in the house, they made an announcement. That night, they said, they would take the campers one by one and make them walk through the old mansion. Two of the counselors, named Dave and Steve, were going to take the campers to the house. Cam said that he was too scared, but they told him that he had to go, and he was the very first one they picked to walk through the mansion. Steve took Cameron with him, and they walked off towards the mansion. Everybody else stayed by the campfire and waited their turn. They waited and waited, but Steve and Cameron never came back. After about an hour of waiting, everyone began to get impatient. Counselor Dave decided to take all of the other campers with him and check out what was going on. When they arrived at the old mansion, they didn't see Steve or Cam anywhere, and the place was eerily silent. Just then they heard a noise. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from upstairs. Dave told the kids that he was going to go up and investigate. He told them to stay behind, but they insisted on going with him. They went upstairs together in a single file, and when they reached the second floor, the noise grew louder. Thump, thump, thump. It seemed to be coming from the room at the end of the hallway. That was apparently the bedroom where Mac Tolliver had murdered his parents. They walked cautiously down the hallway, and when they came to the bedroom door, they could hear another noise. It sounded like dripping. Drip, drip, drip. Counselor Dave reached out, turned the knob, and slowly opened the door. When the door swung open and they saw what was in the room, everyone there screamed in horror. Steve was there, hanging by the neck from a rope. His face was purple, his eyes were bulging out of his head, and his tongue was thrust out of his mouth. His lifeless body was swaying back and forth, and his shoes kept hitting the wall. Thump, thump, thump. His throat had been cut open, and the blood was dripping down onto the floor. Drip, drip, drip. On the wall behind him, scrawled in blood, was a message. The message read, "I'm back," and it was signed, Cam Revelot. All right, everyone. We hope that you've enjoyed this installment of camp-themed horror stories. Like this video, share this with all of your friends. As a matter of fact, start a random email chain and blast it out to everyone you know. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. And most importantly, take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time. And until then, sweet dreams.